The Christian life is filled with green pastures and still waters. But then we get to the part of this verse where it talks about the shadows of death. We don't like that so much. Join us today as you get encouraged by this portion of this verse. Welcome to our Psalm series. We're glad you're joining us. We have been working our way through Psalms, but we've stopped at Psalm 23 because it's such a famous psalm. Most of us know it. And King David wrote this particular psalm. And the reason why is because he was a shepherd. He understood what he was writing about. So we've been moving very slowly. We started out here in Psalm 23, verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That would have made so much sense to David. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. We love all those verses because they're so encouraging to us. But today we're going to move to verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Now, we don't like that quite as much because we're going to start here. The Christian life is filled with green pastures, still waters, and shadows of death. I don't want you ever to forget that. If you can see the picture behind me, you'll be able to see that there's all these shadows in Israel on the mountains depending on where the sun was. And if you're a sheep and you're walking through there, they get scared because they don't like shadows. And so we want to talk a little bit about that today. Now, for most of us, we like the green pastures. We love the still waters. We like it when we're healthy and when there's money in the bank and our kids are all doing really good. Those are the times that we love in life. We feel like we're in those green pastures. For most of us, the whole idea of the shadow of death, we don't like that as well. But remember, if you were a sheep going into one of these down in these cliffs, down at the very, very bottom, they're in like deep ravines or gorges, and this is where the sun would shine and then it wouldn't come in, and there's all these shadows. And if you're a sheep being led through that, the shadows feel very ominous. They're shadowed. They show up in the valleys, the valleys of the shadow of death. And in Israel, there's a lot of these. Here's a picture here where you can see, a lot of these are narrow and damp. Here's another picture right here. They're usually encased by steep stone walls. And so, like, if you look at this one here, you can see, like, if you're a shepherd and you're leading your sheep through there, that's kind of dangerous. And it's scary because it's kind of dark. And you never knew what was down there. And because of the shadows, there were things that were hiding that you could never see. And so a shepherd would have to lead his sheep down into these ravines. And there were shadows. And sheep don't see very well. Now, if you're a good shepherd, you would know that there's a few things you need to really, really look out for in these valleys. The first one is this: predators. There's a lion, okay? Imagine being a shepherd with a whole flock of sheep and coming upon a lion. There were snakes, there were bears, there were wolves, there were leopards. And if you got down into one of these valleys, and suddenly you realize that there's a bear or a wolf or a leopard, your sheep are kind of like their source of food. And we saw this, that David struggled with his exact thing. Look at this in 1 Samuel 17:34. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear." What we see is that David was the kind of shepherd that cared deeply for his sheep. He went after the predators to rescue his flock. And that's what God does for us. As long as we keep our eyes on him, then he can fight our predators for us. And we have one main predator, we know that, Satan himself. 1 Peter 5:8 says this, be self-controlled and alert because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. It's interesting because I bet the lions and the bears were doing that same thing. They were looking for sheep to devour so they could eat them. But in order for a sheep to stay safe, they have to stay very, very close to the shepherd. They have to submit to him, come under his authority, stay close. If the shepherd wants to lead him this way, they better go with him. They need to stick close by his side because a good sheep, or a good shepherd, a sheep knows a good shepherd. They know that the shepherd will take care of them. The Bible tells us that we have that same thing going on in our life. James 4:7 says this, submit yourself then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. See, our job is to submit ourselves to God. And if the devil shows up in temptations or whatever, we just resist him. Nope, not going there. And the Bible says that the devil has to flee from you. So the goal to staying close, keeping Satan away, is staying close to Jesus and coming under submitting under his authority, his shepherdess. I don't even know if that's a word, but I just made that up. Along with predators, there was another problem, and it was this: flash floods. Imagine being in these canyons, these valleys, and you've got these towering walls, and suddenly a flash flood comes along. See, if you're a good shepherd, you're going to have to know weather patterns and rain, when the rain's coming in and how much snow is melting off the mountains. Because if you walk through these canyons, suddenly you're going to see a wall of water coming at you. You will wipe out your entire sheep, if you were a shepherd, in one fell swoop. Brad Gray, he has a website called walkingthetext.com. And it's so good if you ever want to learn more about Psalm 23. But he has a great video about flash floods in Israel, because you can see from this video when a flash flood hits in Israel how devastating it could be for if sheep and a shepherd got caught in it. So watch this.
You've got these treacherous water realities. In fact, here is a video clip of a flash flood I took while living in Israel with a very old camera. That's why it's a bit fuzzy, but you get this sense of, oh my goodness, that's like a torrential, river flow. In fact, this flowed for 24 hours. And flash floods are the #1 killer in the desert. In fact, not long ago, almost 20 students were killed in a flash flood in Israel just a couple weeks before I took a group there. And so you have to understand rainfall and where rain is falling in the hills so that you don't have your flock in a valley where a flash flood will come through and wipe you all out.
But think of this. The shadow of death isn't death itself. It's a shadow. Shadows are scary. Shadows can't actually hurt us. They're just a shadow. But shadows seem to bring fear. But remember, a shadow is just a shadow. But when shadows come into our life, they're dark. We don't see clearly in a shadow. It's not like the bright sunlight where we can see with clarity all around us. The picture behind me shows you this. It's like there's sunshine all up there, but then suddenly there's these dark shadows below. Sometimes it feels that death is right around the corner. Even though it's a shadow of death, it still feels like it. Sometimes in our life, it feels dangerous. It feels scary. I think of those that were there on the day of 9/11 when the towers came crashing down. It could be a scary circumstance, like it's the shadow of death. You don't know if you're going to die, but there's this shadow of death all around you. It could be like a scary situation, like when our daughter found out she had cancer. Like it's not death, it's not a death sentence, but there's a shadow of death there that's kind of very scary. It could be, a car accident that maybe you got into, or someone breaks into your house at night. It doesn't mean you're going to die, But it's those moments that you need to cling to your shepherd. You need to stay so close to him and hang on to him and let him lead you through the valley. But remember, if we walk unprotected through the valleys in life, that would be terrifying. I'd be terrified to get out of bed in the morning if I didn't know that my shepherd was leading and guiding me through these places. Which is why when we go through things in our life, like the job loss, maybe the kid on drugs, the divorce, the bankruptcy, the bad news from the doctor, we can do so with confidence because we have a good shepherd leading us through these dark shadows of death, the dark places in our life. And we can do that even though the shadows feel kind of scary. Now remember, for a sheep, they hated where they're going. Okay, they hated valleys. They hated shadowed valleys. Like I said, if you look behind me at this picture, you can see that they like being up there in the sunshine. But when they go down into the valley and it's dark, they don't have really good eyesight, and so the shadows confuse them. If we don't have good biblical eyesight, that we know that we trust God, he knows what's going on, then we're going to be hating those valleys too. But here's what they knew as a sheep that they had to do in those valleys. They had to keep their eyes on their shepherd. And we have to do the same. The Lord is our shepherd, and when we go through scary times in our life, we need to keep our eyes on him. We need to say, Lord, I know you're leading me. I know it's scary here. I know it's dark. I don't understand what's going on, but I know you're leading me. I know you're with me. I know you care about me. Lord, I'm focusing on you as we go through this valley because I know you know where we're going. And remember the verse, even though I walk through the valley. It doesn't say we're going to die in the valley. It doesn't even say we're going to stop in the valley. It says we're going through the valley, which means there's going to be, outside of through, there's going to be sunshine again. But here's what you need to know is that there are times when those shadows of death actually become death itself. Philip Keller, I didn't know this until I just read this as I was working on this lesson. He was the one who wrote that amazing book, A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And he said this. He said, "For the child of God, death is not an end, but merely the door into a higher and more exalted life of intimate contact with Christ. Death is but the dark valley opening out into the eternity of delight with God." In other words, as a follower of Jesus, it is not something to fear, but an experience through which one passes on the path to a more perfect life. For Philip, his wife died after a 2-year battle with cancer. He said, "We gently passed through the valley of death." He said both of us were aware of the presence of Christ. There was no fear, just going to a higher ground. I think when we know Jesus, we know we have a purpose here on this earth. We know that he has given us a number of days. I think we can pass through the valley of the shadow of death, and I think we can pass through the valley of death when we know that. When we know so deeply that Psalm 39:16 says this, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and in your book all the days of my life were written before they took shape, as yet there were none of them." Job 14:5, "Since a man's days are already determined, and the number of his months is wholly in your control, and he cannot pass the bounds of his allotted time." When we take very seriously those verses, we understand that God has a number of days for us to live. And through this life, we're going to be passing through a lot of the valleys of the shadows of death, because that's just life. We live in a world where sin and death, it reigns right now. But it won't always be like that. And if in fact you happen to be on the valley of death and not the shadow of death, you walk into eternity if you know Jesus. Forever and ever, he will lead us home to be with him. But here's something to think about with sheep going down into the valley. A lot of times in Israel, the water from the rains or snow runs into the valley streams. So in a sense, down in the valley is the best place to get some really good water. And I think there's a lesson there for us. Sometimes our shepherd walks us through dark valleys in order to get us to a place of really great refreshment. Sometimes you will never ever know how awesome God is. You'll never know how much peace he can give you or how much strength he can give you until you are in a valley with nowhere to go. You will never know that because you will never cling to him. Our good shepherd comes along and he gives us everything we need in the midst of the valley. Think of the deep valleys that David went through. He's the author of this psalm, as we said before. He went through the valley of battles. He was at war a lot. He went through the valley of false accusations. He went through the valley of running for his life from King Saul. He went through a valley from the death of his baby. He went through another valley with the death of his other 2 sons. His daughter was raped. That was a valley. The shame of his sin with Bathsheba, that was a valley. And yet David died loving his shepherd, his God. David died knowing that the good shepherd brought him through all of those dark valleys. And the same can happen with you. What David learned was that God's grace and amazing mercy was there for him all the time. David knew God better at the end of his life than the beginning. He spent time with his shepherd. He knew him well at the end. And I really believe it's because of all the dark valleys that God had to lead him out of. And that's what grew his relationship with God. Dark valleys we don't like. Shadows of death we don't like. But they do have a purpose in our life, and I don't ever want to minimize that at all. Scott Larson shared a personal encounter with a woman named Annette. We're going to read this together because I want you to see this valley of the shadow of death. And you and I will have a choice on what we're going to do with that. Annette and her husband were missionaries in Western Europe when she began to have pain in her back. When the pain became so unbearable that she could no longer function, even with muscle relaxants, X-rays revealed a tumor the size of a grapefruit that had attached itself to her spinal cord. Though surgery would need to be done immediately, the operation was considered somewhat routine and not a particularly high-risk procedure. Something went wrong, however. Annette awakened from the surgery paralyzed from the neck down and in constant, excruciating pain. Not long afterwards, she and her husband and their 5 children returned to the United States, where she could be cared for in more appropriate surroundings. Several years later, Annette's husband invited Scott to their home for a Sunday dinner. This is what he said. He said, "I always admired her, having heard how she refused pain-numbing medications so that she wouldn't just be numbed to all of life. Yet I wasn't sure what to expect from my visit. Would she be bedbound? Would she only be able to communicate a few minutes before she needed rest? What I encountered when I entered their home was a beautifully dressed woman whose outward expression revealed little of her physical pain. During my 5-hour visit, Annette served as a gracious hostess who shared her story with honesty. She told how when she first came out of surgery, she and everyone else focused on praying for God to heal her. When that didn't happen, and she was confined to a 24-hour care at home, she became very depressed. Most people stopped connecting with her. Their lives moved on while Annette's came to a screeching halt. Bible college and missionary training had not equipped her to deal with a life tied to a wheelchair and filled with constant pain. I felt that I was left with 3 choices, said Annette: to kill myself and end the unbearable suffering for all of us, to abandon my faith in God and merely exist on painkillers, or to put my energies into discovering God in the midst of all my suffering. Annette's face beamed, and she said, "I chose the third." And as I began slowly reading the Bible again through the lens of pain and suffering, what I saw was a God who was familiar with both. I thought my pain and suffering had taken me to a place where God could never be found. Instead, it was a place where he became more real to me than I had ever known him to be before. Psalm 23:4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We don't have to be afraid of anything. For sheep, they didn't have to be afraid of storms and predators and raging rivers and food and food or no food. Or why? Because they had a shepherd who would take care of everything for them. For us, it's the same. We don't have to be afraid of sickness or disease or accidents or break-ins, because we know this. Those things are just shadows of death. But when it is time for us to die, as followers of Jesus, our ultimate home is in heaven. Our ultimate eternal home is in heaven. And I guarantee you it is way better there than it is on this earth. Because there will be no tears and no sickness and no disease and no accidents and no break-ins and no spinal cord injuries and no wheelchairs. So whether our shepherd leads us through the valleys here on earth, or he leads us to our new heavenly home, we really don't have to fear anything. So the question I want to leave you with today is this: what do I do with my dark valleys? Will I follow my shepherd? Will I run away in fear? Or will I trust him to take care of me no matter what happens? My prayer is that he takes me through the valleys of the shadow of death. But when I come out on the other end, I will know him better and trust him more. I just want to make sure that we get this settled today. Because when dark valleys hit, these shadows of death, we will have the choice to either fall apart and walk away from God because he isn't doing what I want him to do. Or we can do what Annette did. Because she had those three choices. She could have killed herself and ended her unbearable suffering. She could have abandoned her faith in God. Or she could have put all of her energies into discovering God in the midst of all of her sufferings. I vote we take the time like Annette did to open up our Bible and get to know God better than we ever have before, so we can own this verse. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Hope that helps you today. Have a really good week.